The Brewster F-2A Buffalo is an American fighter aircraft which saw service early in World War II. Designed and built by the Brewster Aeronautical Corporation, it was one of the first U.S. monoplanes with an arrestor hook and other modifications for aircraft carriers. The Buffalo won a competition against the Grumman F-4F Wildcat in 1939 to become the U.S. Navy's first monoplane fighter aircraft. Although superior to the Grumman F-3F biplane it replaced and the early F-4Fs, the Buffalo was largely obsolete when the United States entered the war, being unstable and overweight, especially when compared to the Japanese Mitsubishi A6M-0. Several nations, including Finland, Belgium, Britain, and the Netherlands, ordered the Buffalo. The Finns were the most successful with their Buffaloes, flying them in combat against early Soviet fighters with excellent results. During the Continuation War of 1941 to 1944, the B-239s, denavalized F-2A-1s, operated by the Finnish Air Force, proved capable of engaging and destroying most types of Soviet fighter aircraft operating against Finland at that time, and claimed in the first phase of that conflict, 32 Soviet aircraft shot down for every B-239 lost, producing 36 Buffalo Aces. In December 1941, Buffaloes operated by both British Commonwealth B-339E and Dutch B-339C/D Air Forces in Southeast Asia suffered severe losses in combat against the Japanese Navy's A6M-0 and the Japanese Army's Nakajima K-43 Oscar. The British attempted to lighten their Buffaloes by removing ammunition and fuel and installing lighter guns to improve performance, but it made little difference. After the first few engagements, the Dutch halved the fuel and ammunition load in the wings, which allowed their Buffaloes and their Hurricanes to stay with the Oscars in turns. The Buffalo was built in 3 variants for the U.S. Navy: the F-2A-1, F-2A-2, and F-2A-3. In foreign service, with lower horsepower engines, these types were designated B-239, B-339, and B-339-23, respectively. The F-2A-3 variant saw action with the United States Marine Corps squadrons at the Battle of Midway. Shown by the experience of Midway to be no match for the Zero, the F-2A-3 was derided by USMC pilots as a flying coffin. Indeed, the F-2A-3's performance was substantially inferior to the F-2A-2 variant used by the Navy before the outbreak of the war, despite detail improvements. Design and Development, United States Navy. In 1935, the U.S. Navy issued a requirement for a carrier-based fighter intended to replace the Grumman F-3F. The Brewster XF-2A-1 monoplane, designed by a team led by Dayton T. Brown, was one of 2 aircraft designs that were initially considered. The XF-4F-1 had a double-row radial engine but was a biplane like the F-3F. The U.S. Navy competition was reopened to allow another competitor, the NF-1, a navalized Seversky P-35, but it was eliminated because the prototype could not exceed 267 miles per hour, 430 kilometers per hour. The XF-2A-1 first flew on 2 December 1937, and early test results showed it was far in advance of the Grumman biplane entry. While the XF-4F-1 did not enter production, it later re-emerged as a monoplane, the Wildcat. The Buffalo was manufactured at the Brewster Building in Long Island City, New York. The new Brewster fighter had a modern look with a stubby fuselage, mid-set monoplane wings, and a host of advanced features. It was all metal with flush-riveted, stressed aluminum construction, although control surfaces were still fabric-covered. The XF-2A-1 also featured split flaps, a hydraulically operated retractable main undercarriage and partially retractable tailwheel, and a streamlined framed canopy. As was common at this time, the aircraft lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor. Fuel capacity was only 160 U.S. gallons, 610 liters, 130 imperial gallons, stored in the fuselage. Powered by a 950 horsepower single-row Wright 1820-22 Cyclone radial engine, it had a good initial climb rate of 2,750 feet per minute, 840 meters per minute, and a top speed of 277.5 miles per hour, 446 kilometers per hour. The aircraft was then tested in 1938 in the Langley Research Center full-scale wind tunnel, where it was determined that certain factors were contributing to parasitic drag. Based on the tests, improvements were made to the cowling streamlining and carburetor and oil cooler intakes, and the Buffalo's speed rose to 304 miles per hour, 489 kilometers per hour, at 16,000 feet, 4,900 meters, without any increase in power. Other manufacturers took notice of this 10% increase in speed and efficiency, and wind tunnel tests became standard procedure in the U.S. With only a single-stage supercharger, high-altitude performance fell off rapidly. Fuselage armament was one fixed .5-inch 12.7mm M2 Browning machine gun with 200 rounds and one fixed .30-inch 7.62mm AN Browning machine gun with 600 rounds, both in the nose. The Navy awarded Brewster Aeronautical Corporation a production contract for 54 aircraft, the F-2A-1s. Service testing of the XF-2A1 prototype began in January 1938, and in June, production started on the F-2A1s. They were powered by 940 horsepower Wright 1820-34 engines and had larger fins. The added weight of two additional .5-inch Browning wing guns and other equipment specified by the Navy for combat operations reduced the initial rate of climb to 2,600 feet per minute, 790 meters per minute. Plagued by production difficulties, Brewster delivered only 11 F-2A1 aircraft to the Navy. The remainder of the order was later diverted to the Finnish Air Force in modified form under the export designation Model 239.
A later variant, the F-2A2, of which 43 were ordered by the U.S. Navy, included a more powerful R-1820-40 engine, a better propeller, and integral flotation gear, while still lacking pilot armor and self-sealing tanks. The increase in engine power was welcomed, but to some extent offset by the increased loaded weight, 5,942 pounds, 2,695 kilograms, of the aircraft. While top speed was increased to a respectable 323 miles per hour at 16,500 feet, 5,000 meters, initial climb rates dropped to 2,500 feet per minute, 760 meters per minute. Both the F-2A1 and the F-2A2 variants of the Brewster were liked by early Navy and Marine pilots, including Pappy Boyington, who praised the good turning and maneuvering abilities of the aircraft. The early models, before they weighed it all down with armor plate, radios, and other equipment, were pretty sweet little ships. Not real fast, but the early F-2As could turn and roll in a phone booth. This might reasonably have been expected with the low wing loading in earlier variants, which was comparable with the Mitsubishi A6M Zero's pounds per square foot. The F-2A3 was the last version of the Buffalo to enter service with the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps. A total of 108 examples were ordered in January 1941. By this time, the Navy had become disenchanted with the Buffalo and had become especially annoyed at Brewster Aeronautical Corporation's frequent production delays and its frequent management difficulties. This order was seen more as a way of keeping Brewster's production lines running. They would eventually build Corsair fighters for the Navy as well as Buccaneer Bermuda dive bombers. The F-2A3s were conceived as long-range reconnaissance fighters with new wet wings with self-sealing features and larger fuselage tanks, which provided increased fuel capacity and protection. But this also increased the aircraft's weight by more than 500 pounds, 230 kilograms. The wing and enlarged fuselage tank carried an additional 80 U.S. gal, 300 liters of fuel. At 6 pounds per U.S. gal, 0.72 kilograms per liter, the fuel alone weighed nearly 500 pounds, 230 kilograms. The addition of armor plating for the pilot and increased ammunition capacity further increased the aircraft's weight, resulting in a reduced top speed and rate of climb, while substantially degrading the Brewster's turning and maneuvering capability. The Navy found that the added weight of the F-2A3 also aggravated the problem of landing gear failure during carrier landings. However, the -40 two-speed supercharged Cyclone engine in the F2A3 was an excellent cruising engine, and as such, the F2A3 had some value and saw initial service on the carrier Saratoga and Lexington. Even in late 1940, it was apparent that the Buffalo was rapidly becoming obsolete. It badly needed a more powerful engine and an enlarged wing to offset the increased weight, but the limits of the airframe had been reached, making installation of a larger engine impossible. Soon after deliveries of the F2A3 began, the Navy decided to eliminate the type altogether. However, a project was begun to replace the wing-mounted .50 M2 machine guns with two M2 20mm cannons. At least 8 sets of wings were completed, and at least one F2A3 was fitted with them. By then considered a second-line aircraft, some were transferred to the U.S. Marine Corps, which deployed 2 F2A3 squadrons to the Pacific, one at Palmyra Atoll and another at Midway Island. Those which still remained on board aircraft carriers narrowly missed a combat opportunity when a relief mission was dispatched to Wake Island, but the relief force was withdrawn before completing the mission. Shortly afterwards, F2A3s still in naval service were transferred to training squadrons for use as advanced trainers.
Operational history. The first unit to be equipped with the F2A1 was Lieutenant Commander Warren Harvey's VF-3, assigned to USS Saratoga Air Group. On 8 December 1939, VF-3 received 10 of the 11 Buffaloes delivered to the U.S. Navy. The remaining 43 F2A1s were declared surplus, to be replaced with an equal number of the improved F2A2s, and sold to Finland. Ralph Ingersoll wrote in late 1940 after visiting Britain that the Buffalo and other American aircraft cannot compete with either the existing British or German fighters, so Britain used them either as advanced trainers or for fighting equally obsolete Italian planes in the Middle East. That is all they are good for. Even the Eagle Squadron's American pilots used Hawker Hurricanes instead of the Buffalo. Early in the war, all modern monoplane fighter types were in high demand, however. Consequently, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and the Netherlands East Indies purchased several hundred export models. Finland. In April 1939, the Finnish government contacted the Roosevelt administration requesting the supply of modern combat aircraft as quickly as possible. On 17 October 1939, the Finnish embassy in Washington, D.C. received a telegram clearing the purchase of fighter aircraft. The only strict requirements laid down by Finnish authorities were that the aircraft be already operational and able to use 87-octane fuel. Part of an F2A1 shipment, 44 aircraft originally intended for the U.S. Navy, was diverted to Finland by the U.S. State Department, after the USN agreed to instead accept a later shipment of F2A2 variants. On 16 December, the Finnish government signed a contract to purchase 44 aircraft, an F2A1 variant designated Model B239E by Brewster. Unlike other fighters already in service, the F2A1 and B239E lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and cockpit armor. However, the B239E was built with a more powerful engine than the F2A1, in the form of the Wright R1820-G5, producing 950 horsepower, 710 kilowatts, and the capacity to carry 4 machine guns, rather than the 2 carried by the F2A1. The B239E was also denavalized before shipment. Equipment such as tailhooks and life raft containers were removed. The upgraded engine and slightly reduced net weight, i.e. from the omitted armor and denavalization, resulted in an improved power-to-weight ratio and better general performance. In 4 batches, the B239E was shipped initially to Bergen, in Norway, in January and February 1940 from New York City. The crated fighters were then sent by railway to Sweden and assembled by Saab at Trollhättan, northeast of Gothenburg. After delivery of the B239E, the Finnish Air Force added armored backrests, metric flight instruments, the Vaisala THM-40 gun sight, and 4.50-inch machine guns. The top speed of the Finnish B239s, as modified, was 297 miles per hour,
or 478 kilometers per hour, at 15,675 feet, or 4,778 meters, and their loaded weight was 5,820 pounds, or 2,640 kilograms. In February 1940, pilot Lieutenant Jorma Korhonen flight tested the first B-239 to become operational in Finland. Unfamiliar with the aircraft, he burned out the engine while flying very low at high speed, crashing on a snow-covered field, damaging the propeller and some belly panels. Initially unimpressed, the Finns later witnessed a demonstration by a Brewster test pilot who was able to stay on the tail of a Finnish Fiat G.50 Freccia fighter from Italy. Although the Fiat fighter was faster in level flight, the Brewster could outturn it. None of the B-239E fighters saw combat in the Winter War, 1939 to 1940. However, 5 of the 6 delivered during the war became combat-ready before it ended. The B-239E was never referred to by the name Buffalo in Finland. It was known simply as the Brewster, or by the nicknames Taivaan Helmi, Sky Pearl, or Pohjoisen Taivaiden Helmi, Pearl of the Northern Skies. Other nicknames were Puluvalteri, literally buttloader, American Rauda, American hardware or American car, and Lentava Kaljapulo, flying beer bottle. The total of 44 examples of the B-239E fighters used by the FAF received serial numbers BW351 to BW394.
Finnish pilots regarded the B-239E as being easy to fly, or, in the words of Ace Ilmari Utilainen, a gentleman's traveling, or touring, plane. The Buffalo was also popular within the FAF because of its relatively long range and good maintenance record. This was in part due to the efforts of the Finnish mechanics, who solved a problem that plagued the Wright Cyclone engine by inverting one of the piston rings in each cylinder, which had a positive effect on reliability. The cooler weather of Finland also helped, because the engine was prone to overheating, as noted in tropical Pacific use. The Brewster Buffalo earned a reputation in Finnish Air Force service as one of its more successful fighter aircraft, along with the Fiat G.50, which scored an unprecedented kill-loss ratio of 33-1. In service from 1941 to 1945, Buffaloes of Lentolavue 24, Fighter Squadron 24, claimed 477 Soviet Air Force warplanes destroyed, with the combat loss of just 19 Buffaloes, an outstanding victory ratio of 26-1. During the Continuation War, Lentolavue 24, Fighter Squadron 24, was equipped with the B-239Es until May 1944, when the Buffaloes were transferred to Hävite Lentolavue 26, Fighter Squadron 26. Most of the pilots of Lentolavue 24 were Winter War combat veterans. This squadron claimed a total of 459 Soviet aircraft with B-239s, while losing 15 Buffaloes in combat. The Brewsters had their baptism by fire in Finland on 25 June 1941, when a pair of Buffaloes from 2/LLV-24, operating from Selempa Airfield, FC, intercepted 27 Soviet Tupolev SBs from 201st SBAP, Nu 6, near Heinola. 5 SBs were claimed as downed. Subsequent attacks were repelled by LLV-24 pilots who, by dusk, had flown 77 sorties. Many Finnish pilots racked up enormous scores by using basic tactics against Soviet aircraft. The default tactic was the 4-plane Parvi, with a pair flying lower as bait and a higher pair to dive on enemy interceptors. The Soviet Air Force was never able to counter this tactic. The top-scoring B-239 pilot was Hans Wind, with 39 kills. Lieutenant Hans Wind, with 6 other Buffaloes of LELV-24, intercepted some 60 Soviet aircraft near Kronstadt. 2 Soviet P-2 bombers, 1 Soviet Hawker Hurricane fighter, and 12 I-16s were claimed for the loss of just 1 B-239, BW-378. After evaluation of claims against actual Soviet losses, aircraft BW-364 was found to have been used to achieve 42.5 kills in total by all pilots operating it, possibly making it the highest-scoring fighter airframe in the history of air warfare. The top-scoring Finnish ace, Ilmari Utilainen, scored 34 of his 94.5 kills in B-239s, including 28 in BW-364. During the Continuation War, a lack of replacements led the Finns to develop a copy of the Buffalo built from non-strategic materials, such as plywood. However, the Hummu, as they called it, was already obsolete, and only one prototype was built. By late 1943, the lack of spares, wear and tear, and better Soviet fighters in training greatly reduced the effectiveness of Finnish B-239s, though LELV-26 pilots would still claim some 35 victories against Soviet aircraft in mid-1944. The last victory by a Buffalo against Soviet aircraft was claimed over the Karelian Isthmus on 17 June 1944. From 1943, Finland's Air Force received Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs from Germany, and this much superior fighter re-equipped most Finnish Air Force fighter squadrons. After Finland signed an armistice with the Soviet Union in September 1944, they had to drive Finland's former ally, Nazi Germany, out of the country during the Lapland War. The only clash with the Luftwaffe took place on October 3, 1944, when HLELV-26 intercepted Junkers Ju-87s, claiming the last victories to be made by Brewster pilots in World War II. By the end of the war in Lapland, only 8 B-239s were left. 5 B-239s continued to fly until 1948, with last flights of Brewsters by the Finnish Air Force on 14 September 1948, when they were stored until scrapped in 1953.
Belgium. Just before the start of the war, Belgium sought more modern aircraft to expand and modernize its air force. Belgium ordered 40 Brewster B-339 aircraft, a denavalized F-2A2 fitted with the Wright R-1820 G105 engine approved for export use. The G105 engine had a power output of 1,000 HP, 745.7 kilowatts, peak on takeoff, some 200 HP, 150 kilowatts, less than the engine fitted to the U.S. Navy F-2A2. The arrestor hook and life raft container were removed, and the aircraft was modified with a slightly longer tail. Only one aircraft, 4243 N7, reached France by the time Germany launched its Blitzkrieg in the West on 10 May 1940. The Buffalo was later captured intact by the Germans, and it was partially rediscovered near Darmstadt in 1945. 6 more Belgian Brewsters were offloaded at the French Caribbean island of Martinique and languished on a coastal hillside, never to be flown. The rest of the order went to the RAF. British Commonwealth, Malaya. Facing a shortage of combat aircraft in January 1940, the British Purchasing Commission was established to acquire U.S. aircraft that would help supplement domestic production. Among the U.S. fighter aircraft that caught the Commission's attention was the Brewster. The remaining 32 B-339 aircraft ordered by the Belgians, suspended at the fall of France, were passed on to the United Kingdom. Appraisal by Royal Air Force acceptance personnel criticized it on numerous points, including inadequate armament and lack of pilot armor, poor high-altitude performance, engine overheating, maintenance issues, and cockpit controls, while it was praised for its handling, roomy cockpit, and visibility. With a top speed of about 323 miles per hour, 520 kilometers per hour, at 21,000 feet, 6,400 meters, but with fuel starvation issues over 15,000 feet, 4,600 meters, it was considered unfit for duty in Western Europe. Still desperately in need of fighter aircraft in the Pacific and Asia for British and Commonwealth Air Forces, the UK ordered an additional 170 aircraft under the type specification B-339E. Delivery and assembly of the Buffaloes in Singapore took place in the spring of 1941. The first Buffalo units, numbers 67 and 243 Squadron RAF, were formed at RAF Kallang in March 1941. The B-339E, or Brewster Buffalo Mark I, as it was designated in British service, was initially intended to be fitted with an export-approved Wright R1820 G105 Cyclone engine with a 1,000 HP, 745.7 kilowatts peak on takeoff. The Brewster aircraft delivered to British and Commonwealth Air Forces were significantly altered from the B-339 type sold to the Belgian and French forces in accordance with their purchase order. The Brewster factory removed the Navy life raft container and arrestor hook, while adding many new items of equipment, including a British Mark III reflector gun sight, a gun camera, a larger fixed pneumatic tire tailwheel, fire extinguisher, engine shutters, a larger battery, and reinforced armor plating and armored glass behind the canopy windshield. The Brewster Model B-339E, as modified and supplied to Great Britain, was distinctly inferior in performance to the F2A2 from the original order. It had a less powerful 1,000 HP, 745.7 kilowatts engine compared to the F2A2's 1,200 HP, 890 kilowatts Cyclone, yet was substantially heavier due to all of the additional modifications by some 900 pounds, 410 kilograms. The semi-retractable tailwheel had been exchanged for a larger fixed model, which was also less aerodynamic. Top speed was reduced from 323 miles per hour, 520 kilometers per hour, to 313 miles per hour, 504 kilometers per hour at combat altitudes. In its original form, the B-339 had a theoretical maximum speed of 323 miles per hour, 520 kilometers per hour, at a rather unrealistic 21,000 feet, 6,400 meters, but fuel starvation issues and poor supercharger performance at higher altitudes meant that this figure was never achieved in combat. The B-339E was no different in this regard. Its maneuverability was severely impaired, the aircraft was unable to perform loops, and initial rate of climb was reduced to 2,300 feet per minute or 700 meters per minute. The Wright Cyclone 1890 G105 engine, designated for use in the Buffalo Mark I, was in short supply. Many aircraft were fitted with second-hand Wright engines sourced from Douglas DC-3 airliners and rebuilt to G105 or G102A specifications by Wright. In service, some effort was made by at least one Brewster squadron to improve the type's sluggish performance. A few aircraft were lightened by some 1,000 pounds or 450 kilograms by removing armor plate, armored windshields, radios, gun camera, and all other unnecessary equipment, and by replacing the .50-inch or 12.7mm machine guns with .303-inch or 7.7mm machine guns. The fuselage tanks were filled with a minimum of fuel and run on high-octane aviation petrol where available. At Alorstar Airfield in Malaya, the Japanese captured over 1,000 barrels, 160 cubic meters, of high-octane aviation petrol from British forces, which they promptly used in their own fighter aircraft.
Many of the pilots assigned to the Buffalo lacked adequate training and experience in the type. A total of 20 of the original 169 Buffaloes were lost in training accidents during 1941. By December 1941, approximately 150 Buffalo B-339E aircraft made up the bulk of the British fighter defenses of Burma, Malaya, and Singapore. The two RAAF, and one RNZAF squadrons during December 1941, January 1942 were beset with numerous problems, including poorly built and ill-equipped aircraft. Aviation historian Dan Ford characterized it as the performance was pathetic. Inadequate spare parts and support staff, airfields that were difficult to defend against air attack, lack of a clear and coherent command structure, a Japanese spy in the Army Air Liaison Staff, antagonism between RAF and RAAF squadrons and personnel, and inexperienced pilots lacking appropriate training would lead to disaster.
Although the Mk-1 had .5-inch guns, many aircraft were equipped with .303 Browning mounts and electric firing solenoids, which tended to fail in service. Moreover, according to Flight Lieutenant Mowbray Garden of 243 Squadron RAF, the Buffaloes were supplied with only armor-piercing ammunition and no incendiary. Japanese aircraft lacked armor and self-sealing fuel tanks in the early years of the war, a fact unknown to the Allies at the time. When the Japanese invaded northern Malaya on 8 December 1941, the B-339E initially performed adequately. Against the Nakajima K-27 Nate, the overloaded Brewsters could at least hold their own if given time to get to altitude, and at first achieved a respectable number of kills. However, the appearance of ever greater numbers of Japanese fighters, including markedly superior types such as the Nakajima K-43 Oscar, soon overwhelmed the Buffalo pilots both in the air and on the ground. Another significant factor was the Brewster engine's tendency to overheat in the tropical climate, which caused oil to spray over the windshield, usually forcing an aborted mission and greatly complicating attempts to intercept and destroy enemy aircraft. In the end, more than 60 Buffalo Mk-1 B-339E aircraft were shot down in combat, 40 destroyed on the ground, and approximately 20 more destroyed in accidents. Only about 20 Buffaloes survived to reach India or the Dutch East Indies. The last airworthy Buffalo in Singapore flew out on 10 February, 5 days before the island fell. It is not entirely clear how many Japanese aircraft the Buffalo squadrons shot down, although RAAF pilots alone managed to shoot down at least 20. 80 were claimed in total, a ratio of kills to losses of just 1.3 to 1. Additionally, most of the Japanese aircraft shot down by the Buffaloes were bombers. The Hawker Hurricane, which fought in Singapore alongside the Buffalo from 20 January, also suffered severe losses from ground attack. Most were destroyed. The Fleet Air Arm also used the Buffalo in the Mediterranean in the Battle of Crete in early 1941.
Japanese invasion of Burma, No. 67 Squadron, RAF, was originally formed in Singapore before their redeployment to Burma in October 1941. They were equipped with 30 Buffaloes inherited from 60 Squadron RAF at Mingaladon. The aircraft they received in Singapore were passed on to 488 Squadron RNZAF. They were joined by Curtiss P-40 fighters of the American Volunteer Group, Flying Tigers. AVG crews were initially impressed with the Buffalo, some even urging General Claire Chennault to trade a squadron of P-40s for Buffaloes. In response, Chennault arranged a mock dogfight between both fighters, with First Lieutenant Eric Schilling flying the P-40 and Squadron Leader Jack Brandt flying the Buffalo. Over their training base in Toungoo, the P-40 proved to be superior to the Buffalo. When Schilling and Brandt met again 50 years later, the RAF pilot said, "How I wish I could have swapped my aircraft for yours."
The squadron first saw action on 23 December 1941 when 15 Buffaloes intercepted a formation of 42 Ki-21 heavy bombers, 27 Ki-30 light bombers, and 30 Ki-27 fighters during a daylight raid on Rangoon. Together with 12 P-40s, they claimed 13 bombers destroyed and 7 probable. 4 P-40s, including 2 pilots, were lost, while all the Buffaloes returned safely. Nevertheless, the Japanese succeeded in bombing Rangoon, its port facilities, and RAF Mingaladon, inflicting extensive damage and casualties. The Buffaloes and P-40s carried out air defenses over Rangoon and Mingaladon, as well as strafing missions on Japanese airfields. Like Malaya and Singapore, lack of effective early warning systems greatly hampered British and AVG efforts to defend Burma from air raids. Reports of Japanese aircraft performance from the Malayan campaign prompted Buffalo pilots in Burma to employ different tactics. According to Flight Sergeant Vic Barge, come in from above or at the same level at the very least, then dive away before they got onto you, because if they did get onto you, well, you were shot down. One of the Buffalo's final victories of the Burma campaign was claimed by Barge. He found the wreckage of the bomber and had his picture taken with it as proof. The IJAAF secured air superiority over Rangoon by early February 1942, and with the situation on the ground rapidly deteriorating, No. 67 Squadron withdrew north to Toungoo. On 13 February, the squadron moved further north to Mogwai with only 8 Buffaloes, where they continued to carry out reconnaissance flights as well as escorting Westland Lysanders on ground attack missions. The Buffalo flew its last combat sortie with the RAF on 5 March 1942, escorting Hawker Hurricanes and Bristol Blenheims for an attack on a Japanese airbase in Chiang Mai, Thailand. Only 6 Buffaloes remained when the squadron withdrew to Calcutta, India on 11 March to re-equip with Hurricanes. They were swiftly relegated to training duties, though 2 were briefly acquired by No. 146 Squadron RAF in early April, one of which was regularly flown by squadron leader Count Manfred Chernin. No. 67 Squadron claimed 27 Japanese aircraft destroyed, 8 Buffaloes were shot down, and 8 pilots were killed. For their actions, Squadron Leader Jack Brandt and Flight Lieutenant Colin Pinkney were awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross, the latter posthumously, while Sergeant Gordon Williams received the Distinguished Flying Medal.
Netherlands East Indies. The military air service of the Royal Netherlands East Indian Army had ordered 144 Brewster B-339C and D and B-439 models, the former with rebuilt Wright G-105 engines supplied by the Dutch, and the latter 2 with new 1,200 horsepower Wright R182040 engines purchased from Wright by Brewster. By the time the Pacific War broke out, only about 30 Buffaloes had entered service in the Dutch East Indies. In total, 72 Buffaloes were delivered to the Netherlands East Indies before deliveries were diverted to the RAAF. A small number served briefly at Singapore before being withdrawn for the defense of Borneo and Java. As the Brewster B-339 aircraft used by the MLKNIL were lighter than the modified B-339E Brewster Mark I's used by British, Australian, and New Zealand Air Forces, they were able to successfully engage the Japanese Army Nakajima K-43 Oscar, although both the Oscar and the Japanese Navy's A6M0 still outclimbed the B-339 at combat altitudes. The Zero was faster as well. After the first few engagements, the Dutch halved the fuel and ammo load in the wing, which allowed their Buffaloes and their Hurricanes to stay with the Oscars in turns. In February 1942, they received new model gun sights. Around the same time, the Dutch started to use tracer ammunition as well. These improved their hit ratio. Still, their lack of heavy machine guns, .50, meant their success rate wasn't as high as it could have been. Apart from their role as fighters, the Brewster fighters were also used as dive bombers against Japanese troop ships. Although reinforced by British Commonwealth Buffalo Mark I, B-339E aircraft retreating from Malaya, the Dutch squadrons faced superior numbers in the air, usually odds of 1 against 2 or 3. Timely early warning from British radar would have countered this deficit, especially in avoiding unnecessary losses from raids on airfields. But the British government had decided too late to send these. The first British radar stations became operational only toward the end of February. In a major engagement above Semplak on 19 February 1942, 8 Dutch Brewster Buffaloes intercepted a formation of about 35 Japanese bombers with an escort of about 20 Zeros. The Brewster pilots destroyed 11 Japanese aircraft and lost 4 Brewsters. 2 Dutch pilots died. Only 4 airworthy Buffaloes remained on 7 March. Captain Van Helsingdang led this flight on its final sortie that day and was credited with a 0 before he was killed. This made him and Lieutenant August Diebel the most successful Dutch pilots on the Buffalo with 3 victories each. Altogether, 17 MLKNIL pilots were killed, and 30 aircraft shot down. 15 were destroyed on the ground, and several were lost to misadventure. Dutch pilots claimed 55 enemy aircraft destroyed. USAAF RAAF in Australia. Following the surrender of the Netherlands East Indies on March 8, 1942, a shipment of 17 Brewster B-339-23 fighters ordered for the MLKNIL was diverted to the U.S. 5th Air Force in Australia. All of these Buffaloes were subsequently lent to the RAAF, which gave them the serial number prefix A/51. They were used mainly for air defense duties outside frontline areas, photo reconnaissance, and as mock targets in gunnery training. They served with 1 PRU, 24 Squadron, 25 Squadron, 85 Squadron, and the Air Gunnery Training School at RAAF Williamtown. Between August 1942 and November 1943, 10 of these Buffaloes constituted the Air Defence Force for Perth, Western Australia, while assigned to 25 and 85 squadrons at RAAF Pearce and RAAF Guildford. In 1944, all of the surviving aircraft were transferred to the USAAF.
Which were the most pathetic fighter aircraft of World War II? The fighters that failed their nations. World War II produced some of the greatest fighter aircraft ever built: the Spitfire, P-51 Mustang, Bf-109, FW-190, Zero, and P-47 Thunderbolt. Before every masterpiece, there were aircraft that never lived up to expectations, either because of flawed design, poor engines, bad strategy, or rushed wartime development. Fiat G.50 Freccia, Italy. Too slow, too short-ranged, too outdated. The G.50 was Italy's first monoplane fighter with retractable landing gear, but by the time it entered combat, 1939, it was already obsolete. Its Fiat A74 engine gave it poor high-altitude performance, and its open cockpit was a relic of the 1930s. Armed with only two 12.7mm machine guns, it was badly outgunned by Hurricanes and Spitfires. Italian pilots complained it was sluggish and underpowered, and later replaced it with the Mach-E C202. Why it failed? Outclassed by modern German fighters, poor climb and firepower. Morane Saulnier MS-406, France. Brave pilots, weak plane. France's most numerous fighter at the start of World War II. The MS-406 had decent maneuverability, but was underpowered and lightly armed, only one 20mm cannon and two machine guns. Against the Bf-109E during the Battle of France, it was hopelessly outclassed. Many French pilots performed bravely, but their machines were simply not competitive. Why it failed? Outclassed by modern German fighters, poor climb and firepower. Nakajima K-43, Oscar, Japan. Agile but almost defenseless. The Imperial Japanese Army's main fighter early in the war. Extremely nimble, but that came at a terrible cost. It had no armor, no self-sealing fuel tanks, and only two light machine guns. It was easy to build, but couldn't survive a single hit. Against modern Allied aircraft like the P-40 and P-38, it was destroyed in droves. Why it failed? Excellent agility couldn't compensate for paper-thin protection. Boulton Paul Defiant, Britain. A brilliantly bad idea. Britain's turret fighter concept. No forward guns, just a rotating turret with four .303s. Designed to attack bombers from below or behind, but utterly helpless against single-seat fighters. During the Battle of Britain, German pilots quickly realized they could just attack from the front. Losses were catastrophic. Why it failed? Wrong concept for modern air combat. Lacked forward armament. Heinkel H-112, Germany. The fighter that lost to the Bf-109.
Germany's early attempt at a monoplane fighter. Sleeker and more refined than the Bf-109 in some ways, but it lost the Luftwaffe competition. Its Jumo 210 engine gave poor performance, and production was limited. Some saw service in Spain, but it was quickly forgotten. Why it failed? Outperformed and outproduced by the Bf-109. Dead-end design.
Polikarpov I-16 Rata, Soviet Union. Revolutionary in 1935, obsolete by 1941. The I-16 was groundbreaking when first built, low-wing monoplane, retractable gear. But by Operation Barbarossa 1941, it was outdated. Poor visibility, short range, and weak armament left it no match for the Bf-109F. Soviet pilots flew it bravely, but losses were horrendous. Why it failed? Rapidly outdated, insufficient modernization. Brewster F-2A Buffalo, United States. The shame of the Pacific. The first monoplane fighter of the U.S. Navy. It performed decently in early Finnish hands as the B-239, but in the Pacific it was a disaster. Overweight, underpowered, and prone to mechanical issues, the F-2A was massacred by Zeros. Marine pilots in Midway called it a flying coffin. Why it failed? Poor power-to-weight ratio, inadequate performance in tropical conditions. Messerschmitt Me-163 Comet, Germany. The world's fastest death trap. The only rocket-powered fighter ever used in combat. It could climb at incredible speed, but only for 7 minutes before running out of fuel. Landing was extremely dangerous, many exploded or crashed. It claimed a handful of kills, but losses and technical problems far outweighed success. Why it failed? Too dangerous to operate, poor endurance, impractical weapon system. Reggiani Re 2001 Falco II, Italy. Good looks, bad timing. A beautifully designed fighter that never reached its potential. Shortage of reliable engines crippled production. Italian industry couldn't mass-produce it fast enough to compete with Allied forces. Why it failed? Industrial limitations and underpowered engines. Messerschmitt Me-210, Germany. So bad they recalled it mid-production. Designed as a replacement for the Bf-110 heavy fighter, it was unstable, dangerous to fly, and often crashed. Luftwaffe pilots despised it. It was redesigned into the Me-410, which was much better. Why it failed? Serious aerodynamic flaws, poor flight handling. Analysis. Why some fighters failed. These aircraft weren't all pathetic because of bad pilots or lazy engineers. They were victims of bad timing, flawed doctrines, and industrial weakness. Many nations entered the war unprepared for how fast aviation technology would evolve. Britain learned the hard way that turret fighters were obsolete. Italy and France couldn't modernize fast enough. Japan prioritized agility over survivability. Germany, despite its genius engineers, overreached with overcomplicated designs. Meanwhile, nations like the United States and Soviet Union embraced mass production and simplicity, leading to reliable, powerful machines like the P-51 Mustang and Yak-3. Conclusion: the price of bad design. In the skies of World War II, bad design was fatal. A few extra miles per hour, a few more guns, or a stronger engine often decided life and death. The aircraft above remind us that not every innovation succeeds, and that war rewards practicality over perfection. From the Buffalo's tragic debut to the Defiant's disastrous tactics, these machines taught hard lessons that shaped post-war aviation.
U.S. Marine Corps. At Midway Island, United States Marine Corps Fighter Squadron VMF-221 operated a mixed group of 20 Brewster F-2A3 Buffaloes and 7 Grumman F-4, F-3 Wildcats. They were originally assigned to USS Saratoga as part of a relief force bound for Wake Island, but were diverted to Midway instead.
after the force was controversially recalled on 22 December 1941. Wake Island fell on the following day. The squadron first saw action on 10 March 1942 when a Kawanishi H-8K Emily flying boat was shot down by Captain James L. Neefus near Midway, the Buffalo's first kill in U.S. service. From February-April 1942, the rebuilt squadron, VMF-211, most of which had been lost in the Battle of Wake Island, was re-equipped with F-2A3s and was ferried by the escort carrier Long Island to Palmyra Atoll, where it remained until recalled in July of that year, ferrying their aircraft to land on Long Island to return to Hawaii to re-equip with F-4 F-4s. During the Battle of Midway in 1942, VMF 221 was destined to participate in one of the few aerial combats involving the Buffalo in U.S. military service. The initial Buffalo interception of the first Japanese air raid was led by Major Floyd B. Parks, whose 13-aircraft division did not fly in paired flights of mutually supporting aircraft. After attacking a formation of 30 to 40 Aichi D-3A1 VAL dive bombers escorted by 36 Zeros, the Marines, flying in two divisions of aircraft, downed several Japanese bombers before the escorting Zeros reacted. A furious dogfight developed. 13 out of 20 Buffaloes were lost. Of the 6 Wildcats, only 2 remained flyable at the end of the mission. The losses included the Marine Air Commander, Major Parks, who bailed out of his burning Buffalo, only to be strafed by Zeros after parachuting into the sea. The Marine pilots who managed to shake off the Zeros used high-speed split S-turns or very steep dives. These maneuvers were later found to be the best means to evade pursuit by the highly maneuverable Japanese fighters. One F-2A3 pilot, Marine Captain William Humbird, dove away from his pursuers, then attacked a Zero in a head-on pass, shooting his opponent down. In the battle, some F-2A3s suffered from inoperative guns. The nose-mounted gun's occasional failure to fire was noticed by other users as well. The phenomenon may have been caused by frayed electrical wires in the mechanism that synchronized the nose guns with the propeller. Other Buffaloes had not been fitted with plate armor behind the pilot, making them vulnerable to even a single bullet or shell. Losses were aggravated due to the Japanese practice of strafing pilots who had bailed out. Second Lieutenant Charles C. Hughes, whose Buffalo was forced to retire at the start of the raid due to engine trouble, had a ringside view of the aerial combat. The Zeros came in strafing immediately afterwards. I saw 2 Brewsters trying to fight the Zeros. One was shot down, and the other was saved by ground fires covering his tail. Both looked like they were tied to a string while the Zeros made passes at them. Second Lieutenant Charles M. Coons reported that after successfully downing 2 VAL bombers, he was attacked by Japanese fighters. I was at an altitude of about 9,000 feet and shoved over in a dive trying to shake the plane on my tail until I was about 20 feet from the water. I was making radical turns hoping the pilot couldn't get steadied on me. I glanced out of the rear and saw that it was a Zero fighter. I continued flying on a rapid turning course at full throttle when I was hit in the head by a glancing bullet. After he fired a few short bursts, he left as I had been in a general direction of 205 degrees heading away from the island. My plane was badly shot up. In my opinion, the Zero fighter has been far underestimated. I think it is probably one of the finest fighters in the present war. As for the F-2A3, or Brewster trainer, it should be in Miami as a training plane rather than used as a first-line fighter. Claire Chenault's report on the Zero and air combat reached Washington in 1941, where it was disseminated to aviation forces of the U.S. Army and Navy. This information, along with the development of two-plane mutual defensive formations and tactics, were incorporated into U.S. and Marine Corps air combat training doctrine by some prescient U.S. commanders, including Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch. The Thatch Weave was developed for use by Wildcat pilots against the Zero and was later adopted by other Wildcat squadrons in the Pacific. With the emergence of new tactics for the F-4 F-3 and F-4 F-4 Wildcat, the Battle of Midway marked the end of the Buffalo in both U.S. Navy and Marine Corps fighting squadrons. Surviving F-2A3 aircraft were transported to the U.S. mainland, where they were used as advanced trainers. The introduction in late 1943 of vastly superior American carrier-borne fighters such as the F-6F Hellcat and Vought F-4U Corsair soon relegated the Brewster F-2A3 to a distant memory.
Buffalo Aces. The Finnish Air Force produced 36 Buffalo Aces. The top 3 were Captain Hans Wind, with 39 Buffalo air victories out of 75, W.O. Aino Ilmari Uutilainen, with 34 out of 94, and Captain Jorma Karhunen, with 25.5 out of 31.5. First Lieutenant Lauri Nisinen also had victories in the type, 22.5 out of 32.5. The non-Finnish Buffalo Aces were Jeff Fisken, RNZAF, with 6 air victories, and Doug Vanderfield, RAAF, with 5 individual kills plus 1 shared. Alf Clare, RAAF, and Maurice Holder, RAF, had 5 victories each.